Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, could ICE violence in Minnesota escalate into civil war?
It's a perfect setup for a conflict between the National Guard and federal forces.
We talked to one expert who explains why the U.S. could be headed towards internal armed conflict. I'm Manuel Rapalo, and this is The Take. Hi. Before we continue with today's show, remember to leave us a comment telling us what you think about this episode. Are you watching carefully what's going on in Minneapolis? And are you concerned? If you're listening on a podcast app, leave us a review and give us a 5-star rating while you're there. It helps the show. All eyes have been on the U.S. state of Minnesota for weeks now, as ICE operations ramp up, sparking protests and widespread unrest across the city of Minneapolis. Then, this news broke on Saturday.
I want to take you to the U.S. city of Minneapolis, where officials are saying they are aware of reports of another shooting involving federal law enforcement.
Alex Preddy was shot and killed. Vigils for him are happening across the metro.
Officials later said the man had died. Minneapolis city officials said the man is a 37-year-old white male, a resident of Minneapolis. They also say he is believed to be an American citizen and that he was a lawful gun owner with a permit to carry.
This marks the second killing by federal law enforcement in Minneapolis in recent weeks, following the January 7th fatal shooting of 37-year-old Renee Good by an ICE agent. I just landed in Minnesota to cover this breaking news story. We'll have more for you in the coming days. But on Friday, before this latest news broke, I spoke to someone who's been keeping a close eye on Minneapolis.
I'm Claire Finkelstein. I'm the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, and I run a national security center called the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania.
So, Claire, let me bring the audience to the United States of America, where we both are right now. I want to describe a scene to you. It starts with a law enforcement operation in the city of Philadelphia, where you are, and it ends with an armed conflict between state forces and federal forces led by the President of the United States. Of course, this hasn't happened yet, and is actually the result of a simulation conducted by the University of Pennsylvania's Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, which you direct. Claire, for those who aren't familiar, can you lay out what happened during this simulation, during this exercise?
So at the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, we wanted to really try to anticipate what some of the threats to the rule of law might be during and after the 2024 presidential election. And so we took a bunch of former, mostly retired public servants, retired military, people who had been in government, some of them at quite high levels. And a few of them were actually currently in office in state and local government as a way of trying to prepare ourselves and trying to write a report that would help prepare the country for what might be coming, which is that there could be a clash between National Guard troops deployed very possibly by a governor or by the president using his federalization powers and federal troops. Now, you might wonder how it could happen that a president who has federalized National Guard troops could ever find that National Guard troops are conflicting with federal troops, regular military, that a president has deployed. But in our scenario, that's exactly what happened. And the National Guard actually ended up loyal to the governor instead of the president.
Reminding our listeners that this is the result of a simulation, but we are having you on the show today because of how eerily similar the results of that exercise, that tabletop exercise as you describe it, are to what's going on in Minnesota.
Protests, tear gas, and more arrests. There's no sign of the anger subsiding in Minneapolis.
And Claire, I was just in Minnesota very recently. I arrived in Minneapolis on the day that Renee Good, that 37-year-old American citizen who was shot by an ICE agent, I arrived that same day to report for Al Jazeera English News. To you, what are those similarities that you're seeing there and in the tabletop exercise?
So what has happened in Minneapolis, and I think this is based on very significant, wide, and consistent reporting, is that ICE agents are using force in many instances unlawfully. And the example that you just gave, the shooting of Renee Good, is a primary example that has really ignited people. I think there can be little doubt in people's minds at this point that it was an unlawful use of force on behalf of the ICE agent that shot her. So thinking about the fact that we have federal agents who are engaging in unlawful uses of force, what is a governor supposed to do? What is Governor Walz supposed to do? He cannot stand by and watch that idly play out without doing something to protect his citizens. He has put the National Guard on notice. They are on standby and they are ready to mobilize if need be. The president has meanwhile readied federal forces in Alaska and is threatening to send those into Minnesota. So it's a perfect setup for a conflict between the National Guard and federal forces, in this case, the 11th Airborne. And that was more or less the situation that we had imagined and predicted could occur in our tabletop exercise.
Like you said, Claire, it's kind of a perfect storm, these conditions that are being met that are so similar to the simulation that your team ran. Let's speak a little bit about the rule of law here and how it applies to the armed forces specifically.
You can refuse illegal orders.
You can refuse illegal orders.
You must refuse illegal orders.
Claire, these are statements by U.S. senators and members of the U.S. Congress who were either formerly military or formerly members of the intelligence community, speaking directly to current members of the military, to current intelligence officers via social media. How does that play into this scenario that we're discussing?
So let's be clear about what that video said and what it didn't say. What it said was black letter law, something that would be taught at any military academy, taught at any national security law class. It's what I teach my students, which is that members of the military have a duty not to carry out illegal orders. If you're sure that you have received an illegal order, not only can you disobey, but you must disobey and report that up the chain of command. Now, why is it relevant in this situation? It's relevant because if federal forces are called out, such as the 11th Airborne, to Minnesota, they will be engaged to back up ICE agents. And if ICE agents are behaving unlawfully, then that is an unlawful order. And as a member of the military, you cannot come in and use force to ensure that a federal agent has the ability to carry out an illegal act. So if ICE is engaging in shooting protesters in the legs, or ripping people out of their cars, or shooting women who have just dropped their kids off at daycare and are not threatening them through the windshield of their cars and killing them, federal forces cannot back up those agents without engaging in an illegal activity. And they cannot lawfully carry out any orders to back up ICE agents. And meanwhile, we will have the Minnesota National Guard who will be there to protect police officers and citizens who will be potentially peacefully exercising their First Amendment rights to protest, for example. And if those are the facts on the ground, and they may or may not be when and if this should occur, then the Minnesota National Guard will be constitutionally and otherwise lawfully in the right, and they will have the right to carry out the governor's orders.
After the break, more with Claire Finkelstein. The rest of this episode will be audio only, so sit back and enjoy. So, Claire, I want to ask you more about rule of law. We were speaking about that in your last answer. There's a part of the U.S. system of government, checks and balances, that we haven't gotten too far into yet, which is the judicial system. My thought process as I'm hearing all of this is, where is the judicial system in all of this now?
This is a really critical point. President Trump seems to think that lawful orders means whatever he orders, but that's not the case. Otherwise, the oath of office and the oath of enlistment would just say, be loyal to the president, no matter what. Now, the oath of enlistment does say, I swear to obey the orders of the president and the Constitution. And if the two conflict, the troops have a duty to follow the Constitution. And it's federal courts who interpret the Constitution for federal troops. They don't have to sit there studying the Constitution and figure out what it means by itself. They're not expected to be lawyers. Judges tell us what the law says, and then military commanders have to translate that with the help of their JAGs, with the help of their legal advisors, which is why the JAGs are so important here, into a set of workable rules. And it's critical that those rules translate what is truly the law into workable rules for troops on the ground. Otherwise, your whole chain of command falls apart. And I think we're seeing some evidence of that on the ground in Minnesota.
Let's get back to the simulation a little bit and the things that you may not have been able to foresee back then. You ran this experiment in October of 2024. A lot has changed since then. And as former U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld once said, there are known knowns and there are unknown unknowns and known unknowns, right? So what factors that you may not have taken into consideration back then are you seeing now that are of concern?
Well, there was one major thing we did not anticipate, and that was the Supreme Court decision in Trump v. Illinois.
The U.S. Supreme Court has blocked the Trump administration from deploying the National Guard in Illinois in a 6 to...
We played a part in that, in fact, because we represented 155 members of Congress in filing a brief in that case before the Supreme Court, an amicus brief, to say why we thought it was so crucial that the president's federalization of National Guard and deployments to all the different cities, but we were focused on Illinois in that case, was unlawful. And to say that it was critically important that Congress be the determining factor, not presidential discretion in following the parameters of what the lawful use of force was under the statute that the president was using to federalize troops. And so the Supreme Court, much to our surprise, agreed with us and with other briefs that were filed and with Illinois to say that, in fact, the use of National Guard troops has been unlawful and forbade the president from using National Guard troops as a provisional matter. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this use of ICE agents on such a large scale, because they're basically substituting for the National Guard and being used as a kind of paramilitary force in the wake of that decision. Another thing is that there's a large subject that we didn't talk about, which is the impact of presidential immunity on all of this. The Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law filed an amicus brief in the immunity case. On that decision, which came down before President Trump was reelected, Trump v. United States, was very, very impactful in all of this, because the president was basically told that anything that he did in his official capacity could not subject him to indictment, investigation, and possible prosecution. Now, anything that he does as commander-in-chief will count as an official capacity act. And so he knows if he's deploying federal troops to Minnesota, even if he's deploying them to back up ICE officers who were behaving unlawfully, that he's going to be immune to criminal prosecution. And then the next question is whether or not his immunity travels down the chain of command at all. And the Supreme Court doesn't answer that question. So that's another unknown that a future Supreme Court decision could try to address.
You know, Claire, I think people are feeling nervousness over whether or not more violence is around the corner. Your simulation, it's a hypothetical simulation, but it does paint a picture and lays out a warning of a possible future. And it's a future path that I hope that we're not going down. I think most people are not hoping that that's the future of America. What do you think is needed to prevent that future from happening?
So we need court decisions. We need courts to step in. With some exceptions, by and large, this administration has adhered to court decisions, and that's a bright spot. And as I mentioned, it was paradoxically the decision in Trump v. Illinois that has produced the effect of the Trump administration surging the number of ICE agents, which shows the adherence to court decisions. Otherwise, they might just have ignored the Supreme Court and kept the National Guard troops federalized and left them in U.S. cities. And instead, they withdrew them. And so it seems to me the best that we can hope for here is that courts will be able to step in and firmly articulate rule of law guidelines on the use of force and make clear to the Trump administration, make clear to governors exactly what is lawful and what is not lawful, as well as to protesters, I should say, because to the extent that protesters do sometimes use unlawful force, they need to hear that as well. And courts need to rein them in and articulate that, and there needs to be accountability. So everybody needs to abide by the rule of law on all sides, but only judges can really pronounce on what that law is, and that should resolve doubts. Now, one of the conclusions of our tabletop exercise, however, was that these scenarios could unfold so quickly that judges might not have time to intervene, or they might be unwilling to intervene because there are doctrines called justiciability doctrines that might lead a court to say, you know what, we can't get involved here. And that's, in a way, what concerns me most. If the federal courts can't step in to resolve these disputes, then I think we're in real trouble.
Claire Finkelstein, professor of law, professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and the director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. Thank you very much for joining us on The Take.
Thanks for having me.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Kylene and Melanie Marich, with Phillip Lanos, Spencer Cline, Tamara Khandaker, and me, Manuel Rapalo. It was edited by Kylene Kiang. The Take production team is Marcos Bartolomé, Sonia Bhagat, Spencer Cline, Sarí el-Khalili, Tamara Khandaker, Kylene Kiang, Phillip Lanos, Kylene, Melanie Marich, Halima Shah, and Noor Wazwaz. Our editorial intern is Tulin Baccarat. I'm your host, Manuel Rapalo. Our engagement producers are Adam Abugad and Vienna Maglio. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Our video editors are Hisham Abu Salah and Mohamed Al-Melham. Alexander Locke is The Take's executive producer. Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.